Welcome, folks. So, in our previous lecture, we began our discussion of infectious disease and epidemiology. We're going to continue with that theme by talking about how our body, both naturally and artificially, is able to be protected from potential disease-causing agents and pathogens, even just foreign particles as well. And so what we'll do is we'll begin this discussion with chapter 15, where we talk about innate immunity, which is just the very first layers of defense that our body provides that provide a barrier and clearance of foreign particles and potential pathogens. Then in chapter 16, we'll talk about our adaptive immune system, which very specifically targets very specific pathogens and eliminates them from our body, or cells that are cancerous, for example. Then in chapter 10, we're going to talk about artificially how we've actually taken some various chemicals, oftentimes produced by bacteria and other living agents from the environment, and utilized those as antibiotics, antimicrobials, antivirals to protect us from these potential pathogens. And we continue that discussion in chapter 17, where we talk about vaccines, where we're able to, engineer various components of pathogens and utilize them as vaccines. Okay, so go ahead and pause the video, review any previous content that you'd like to review, and preview chapter 15, and then jump right back in. Okay, welcome back. So our body has quite the task, right? Because the human body, if you think about the interface between the human body and the environment, that our body has to protect us from potential pathogens that might be in that interface, it's a significant amount of surface area, right? So you might initially think of the skin. Okay, the skin is our barrier between us and our environment. And so if you take the skin on average, the amount of surface area on the skin is about 1.5 to 2 meters square. Okay, so at the chemical and biological level, our body has to protect every millimeter of that surface to make sure that these very, very tiny microbial agents like bacteria and viruses, maybe prions, can't come in and actually cause disease within our body. But it's not just our skin that interfaces with the environment. Actually, we also need to consider our mucosal membranes. Even though they're internal to our body structures, they come in direct contact with environmental factors. So, for example, when we eat something, that's a particle from the environment, and it goes into our digestive tract, then that's an environmental component that comes into direct contact with our body. Same when you breathe in, any particles that come in with that air are then exposed to the surface area within our respiratory tract, and that also is a surface that needs to be protected. And so, in that way, our body has a real task to be able to protect us from these external agents, whatever they are, that may or may not be pathogenic. And so, also, that distinction is important. And the way that our body does that is by providing a couple different lines of defense. The first line of defense is just a barrier and clearance. Okay. So, for example, the skin and the chemicals on our skin that basically provide a barrier against pathogens. But then, if a pathogen does land onto the skin or does kind of get situated within the microbiome of the skin, then it can generally be cleared out because the body says, oh, okay, based on this structure, that this very general chemical on the skin will provide clearance for that structure that tends to be similar to or part of various bacteria. Okay, so that's just generally your skin and the chemicals on your skin providing clearance. But then there's also more specific layers of defense, like your adaptive immune system. And so between chapters 15 and 16, we'll go into more detail into both of those. But here is a quick overview of just kind of defense generally.
Host defenses can be divided into two categories: innate or non-specific defenses and adaptive or specific defenses. These defenses act together to protect the host against infection. The human body has many innate or non-specific defenses to prevent disease. These include the first-line defenses such as the skin and mucous membranes, plus the second-line defenses such as phagocytosis, inflammation, and the complement system. All of these defenses act against all pathogens and are not specific to a given pathogen. The third line of defense is comprised of the adaptive or specific defenses. These defenses recognize a specific pathogen and must be activated by antigen-presenting cells before they can work. These defenses include antibodies and cytotoxic cells. Together, these defenses make it very difficult for pathogens to penetrate, colonize, and cause disease.
Okay. So, in a way, we can call these first couple of lines of defense that our body has that provide a barrier and clearance the science of skin, sweat, snot, blood, pus, and tears. And that's exactly where those first couple of lines of defense are coming from. Our skin is a physical barrier, and then you layer onto that the various components of sweat, snot, blood, pus, and tears. And those together help make sure that our body does not come into contact with, or pathogens do not come into contact with our body in a way that they can cause disease. And so we're actually going to just basically go through these in the lecture and talk about skin and sweat, and then talk about snot, blood, pus, and tears as a way of understanding how our body is protecting us from various agents in the environment. Okay. And this protection includes both physical surfaces as well as chemical components, as well as biological components that are part of our immune system. And so all in all, those are going to be an essential part of our discussion today. So the way that we're going to do this is both familiar and unique in that we're going to go through each of these different components by first watching an external resource video, and then coming back in and summarizing that in the lecture. And so for this first part of chapter 15, we'll basically alternate between external resources and this lecture here. And what we're going to do, our goal at the end, is a discussion post that summarizes how skin, sweat, snot, blood, pus, and tears are providing a barrier and clearance against potential pathogens in the environment. So my recommendation as we go through these various parts, just take a note, one or two sentence summary of each part so that you can aggregate that into your discussion post for this section of the material. Okay, so let's start with the skin. So go ahead and pause the video. There are two videos linked in the description. One is on skin, one is on sweat. Go ahead and watch those. The total run time is about 17 minutes, and then come back into this lecture here. Okay, welcome back. So what you saw in that video is that the skin is like this physical barrier that essentially has a number of different functional layers that allow it to provide kind of a barrier against the environment. The very top layer is called the epidermis. These are tightly packed skin cells that are flat, and as they are growing, and they grow very rapidly, they're pushed up to the top. And those cells that die first and are at the very top, they're dead. There's actually a layer of dead skin cells that are still providing the function of creating a barrier, that kind of dry, flat surface at the very top. Now, also within the epidermis, we have some really amazing cells called dendritic cells. And there was a specific type of dendritic cell that was mentioned in our video. And essentially, these dendritic cells they Dendritic, the name, is because they look like a dendrite or like a kind of like a starfish shape. And they have these pseudopods that reach out between the layers of skin cells within the epidermis. And there's so many of them within the layers of the skin within the epidermis that they actually provide a pretty continuous network of protection within the epidermis. And what these guys are doing are kind of perusing through the cells of the epidermis to look for foreign objects or foreign agents. And as they find them, they can pick them up and phagocytize them, break them down. But they can also, and this is the really cool part, they can also report them back to the immune system, right? And it's just really amazing the function of dendritic cells in that they can actually, once they find a pathogen, they can say, okay, I need to report this to the immune system. And then they can actually leave their post in the skin, send out chemicals to recruit new immune cells to come into that area or to be generated in that area to take their place. And they can actually take the particles of those pathogens that they find or those foreign agents that they find to the lymphatic system to say, hey, this is what I found. Is it a problem? Or this is what I found. Let's analyze this a little bit and recognize it. And there's different types of dendritic cells, and they work in different ways, but essentially they can present both to B and T cells within the adaptive immune system, so that the adaptive immune system can very specifically call out potential pathogens, right? And so dendritic cells are amazing in what they do, but they're also that connection between our innate immune system and our adaptive immune system because they literally, physically take components of some of the pathogens or foreign agents that they find and present them to the adaptive immune system. They're actually called professional antigen presenting cells because many cells present components of their environment or components of their internal systems on their cell membrane, but dendritic cells are professional in that they actually have extra receptors so that they can present to the immune system what they find. And it's just amazing that there are these cells posted throughout our skin looking for foreign agents. And then when they find something, they can digest it, but not just stop there. They can literally report it back to the adaptive immune system and say, hey, this is what we're finding. And before they leave, they release chemicals to actually recruit new cells in that area to become dendritic cells and take their place. So very amazing, just really, really cool cells that are in that first upper layer of our skin, and they're kind of looking out for us there. Then as we move beyond the epidermis into the dermis, this area is more moist and it has more vasculature, so lots of blood vessels. This is where our hair follicles are. And in that area, there are another set of immune cells called mast cells. And mast cells are they're part of the immune system that predominantly are communicating out. So maybe a dendritic cell finds a pathogen, then when it communicates that, okay, I found a pathogen, it'll release chemicals called cytokines into the environment. Mast cells will pick up that signal and again amplify out. They don't physically move, mast cells tend to stay in place, but they can amplify out through a chemical signaling more cytokines into the immune system. And we'll talk more about this in chapter 16 to call out, or, between chapter 15 and 16, to call out reinforcement from the immune system. So another layer of biological response to potential harms in the environment that you have in the dermis. So in the epidermis, we have our skin cells and our dendritic cells. In our dermis, we have a more moist area where we have our blood vessels. We also have collagen, which are these protein fibers that help keep our skin both flexible and resistant at the same time. And then we have a living component of our immune response, which are mast cells, and they can literally call out for reinforcements if our dendritic cells, and there are a number of other cells like macrophages, for example, which we'll talk about a little bit more later. Another type of cell that kind of just peruses through our cells looking for various invaders. And these macrophages are in various types of tissue, and they can engulf them and then raise the alarm. Okay. And mast cells help actually raise this alarm. Now, you can see here's some of these dendritic cells in this image here, and you can see how their pseudopods are literally just kind of like sticking through the different cells around them, looking for potential invaders. Okay. Um, and so in that way, you have a physical barrier that's very dynamic and is able to look out for pathogens. Now, what are these cells looking for? They're looking for uh, basically general characteristics of bacteria and viruses. So, for example, bacteria and viruses are a little bit different from our cells in that they tend to have maybe they have flagella, for example, or maybe they have different types of pili and fimbriae. Maybe they have peptidoglycan instead of our cell membranes, which are composed very differently. They, we have our phospholipid bilayer, but we don't have a peptidoglycan cell wall. And so they're just generally looking out for characteristics of invaders. And that's what they're called attention to, and that's what they clear out. These dendritic cells, macrophages, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, and then the amplified response from the mast cells. All of these are just looking for generally things that don't look like they belong there, right? And that's going to be different from our discussion in chapter 16 when we're talking about the adaptive immune system, which is literally related to antibodies that are very, very specific to very, very specific pathogens within the environment. Okay. Here's an image of that first layer of skin cells. Now, there is this sort of idea that dust, for example, is primarily composed of dead skin cells. And the truth about that is, if you look at the biological component of dust, so specifically, what are the living parts of dust? Yes, that is predominantly skin cells, but a vast majority of dust is abiotic. It's non-biological particles. So, for example, soil, particles, maybe lint, things like that, little pieces of fabric from our houses or our clothes, depending on the environment, are the predominant kind of components of dust. Although dead skin cells are an important part of dust as well, because they're continuously being released into the environment as they grow very quickly and then are that very top layer of our skin. Now, we said that within the layers of our skin here, the dermis, hypodermis, which also has various types of vascular tissue, it also has adipose tissue, and it connects to these follicles. But these hair follicles and the various glands around them are also producing sweat. And sweat is another really important component of the skin. One, the skin has that collagen and then that very top dry layer of skin that work together to make sure that the skin is both rigid and flexible. But that works best when it's moisturized with various types of oils, for example. And so our sweat is a liquid solution that includes an oily substance called sebum, but also salts, which inhibit the growth of microorganisms, specific peptides, not a full protein necessarily, but little peptide components that inhibit the growth of microorganisms, and then enzymes called lysozymes. And so, all in all, sweat, its function is both to moisturize our skin and inhibit foreign agents, specifically things that look like pathogens. Okay. And so it's not general, it's not looking for a specific pathogen, but salt, for example, many organisms that would be pathogenic to the human body are not going to be halotolerant because the inside of the human body is not very salty. And so just the fact that we have salt is going to inhibit a number of different pathogens within the human body. Antimicrobial peptides act against microorganisms generally and just kind of clear them out. And lysozymes, sorry, are these enzymes that specifically take out peptidoglycan. Okay, so many bacteria, particularly our gram-positives, but even our gram-negatives will have peptidoglycan. That peptidoglycan will literally just be broken down, like specifically gram-positive organisms by these lysozymes. And it's not recognizing a specific bacterium, but just generally, lysozymes will break down bacteria on our skin. Okay. And so that allows us to maintain these chemical and microbial or chemical balance that allows us to kind of clear out potential pathogens. Okay. Also, the aggregate of sweat maintains a pH balance that also helps us mitigate the kind of the microbial community on our skin towards a more healthy microbiome as well. Okay. Some of the chemicals that are on our skin, these antimicrobial peptides, are called dermcidins, and these are skin cidin means to eliminate or kill, and that's in your book when it says dermcidins is related to these antimicrobial peptides. Okay. Okay. So that's our discussion of skin and sweat. Our next discussion is going to be mucus. So if you could go ahead and pause this video and then go to the description and look at the third video in the description, which literally just says mucus, TED. Go ahead and watch that and then come back into our video here. Okay? Okay, see you in a couple minutes. And welcome back, folks. So, mucus, right? It's something that can be very annoying, right? Problematic. But really what it is doing, it's a substance that's providing a way for us to clear potential pathogens from our body. And it's providing a way to essentially coat the mucosal membranes within our body with a substance that then allows us to release potential pathogens. So what is mucus? Well, mucus is made up of mucin, water, one, you know, that's kind of a large component of mucus. Then mucin, which is a glycoprotein. So it's a part sugar, part protein. And you can imagine kind of that stickiness that would come from a sugar protein combination. And that's kind of like what makes up the basis of mucus. But then within that mucus, that mucin water mix, there are a number of other components. So you have different chemicals that are, again, like antimicrobial peptides that are in that. You have just, cells from your immune system that are in there, like white blood cells, antibodies, which are related to the adaptive immune system, but they're important here as well, antibodies. And you also even have a living component to mucus. So you have part of your microbiome, including both bacteria and viruses. And these bacteria produce their own various types of antibiotics. And that living component is also an important component of taking out potential pathogens that get into our mucus. So, for example, the surfaces of our respiratory tract are covered in mucus. And as we breathe in, maybe dust particles or maybe a pathogen comes in. And as that gets lodged into the mucus, well, you've got all of those different chemicals. You have those living components like white blood cells and the microbiome. You have antibodies. All of those engage with that potential pathogen to try to neutralize it. But also, when you're sick, or even just throughout your day when you're not sick, that mucus is continuously being kind of brought up and out of your body, up and out of your body, but particularly when we're sick and we're coughing, for example, up and out of our body just to physically remove potential pathogens that get lodged into the mucus. Okay. And so this mucus is essentially covering all of our mucosal membranes. So from our digestive tract, respiratory tract, urinary, reproductive surfaces, all of those, so that that very thin, dynamic skin of those surfaces is protected in an extra way. So our skin is dry at its surface, like the skin external to our body rather than the internal epithelium is dry, and that provides that protective layer. But in these more dynamic wet surfaces, the mucus covers those surfaces and allows for an additional layer of protection. Um, so interestingly, mucus is produced by cells called goblet cells, and in certain areas in our body, it's moved around by what are called ciliated epithelium. So epithelium being skin cells, ciliated meaning having little cilia or little tails or hairs. And so in that way, the goblet cells release the mucus and it starts to pick up some of, it's got the mucus, it has those various chemicals, it starts to pick up some of the microbiome, and then it's moved through that area with ciliated epithelial cells. And oftentimes, particularly in the respiratory tract, the mucus is moved out, right? Um, you know, Essentially releasing any pathogens that might be lodged in that mucus. So here is a little example of that here where you can see in this animation, we're looking at, one second, let's see if I can get rid of this line here. Okay, so you can see those little blue ciliated epithelial cells. These are the goblet cells, and that's them releasing mucus. Now, that particle, that's some sort of particle like pollen or maybe dust or something. There's a red blood cell that's getting trapped in that mucus. And then these ciliated epithelial cells push the mucus out of our body to kind of release those components so that they don't cause harm. Okay. So I imagine just kind of like an escalator that's essentially pushing foreign agents out of our body, and on the transportation is that mucus, right? Okay. And so in that way, mucus is helping us to kind of maintain those various surfaces within our body. So our next discussion is tears. And so the tears video is next in the description. It's about 4 minutes long, and then we'll come back in here and review what we heard there. Okay. So tears, so of the surfaces that need to be protected, our eyes are pretty unique because they're a moist surface that's actually continuously exposed to the environment. If you think of our other mucosal surfaces, there's some sort of protection, like the inside of our mouth or urogenital tracts, for example, there's some sort of closed off protection for those surfaces. Whereas the eyes are pretty continuously exposed to the external environment. And so there's this additional layer of protection with tears that are produced, you can see here, in our lacrimal glands, and we have ducts and glands both above and below our eye that produce and then drain those tears. And then within those tears, we have our lysozymes, antimicrobial peptides, and that allows us to, one, maintain the moisture of the eye surface, but then two, it allows us to kind of clear any potential pathogens that come into that surface as well. And so, similar to some of those chemicals, antimicrobial peptides, lysozymes that we had seen on the skin, those are also going to be in tears to help make sure that the surface of the eye is protected from pathogens. Okay. Um, so Hmm. Okay, well, I wish we had had this note when we talked about mucus, but we'll go ahead and jump a little bit here to the microbiome and then continue our discussion as well. But when we talked about mucus, we talked about the living components of the mucus, right? And those living components include parts of the microbiome, right? And so you actually have bacteria and you actually have some viruses. So your, virome that are included in that mucus. And so let's take a minute to kind of appreciate what are some of the things that the microbiome is doing for us. Now, we've already had some of these discussions for our homework assignment, but essentially what the microbiome is naturally occurring, mostly bacteria, although there are some fungi and a couple of archaea that are also part of that, and even a couple of animals that are included in the microbiome, um, which colonizes the surface of our body. And there's a lot of benefits that the microbiome provides for our body. So the consumption of nutrients, also consumption of let's give an example of that. So for example, there's certain oligosaccharides, sugars that are a little bit complex that we ingest that need to be broken down by microorganisms. Actually, our body, our gastrointestinal tract ourselves wouldn't be able to break those down. And so you have different types of organisms that can actually do that, like bifidobacterium, that are actually breaking down those oligosaccharides, releasing the nutrients so that we can utilize them. Okay. Also, creating an environment that's unfavorable for pathogens, but favorable for the body. So, a really great example of this is lactobacillus within the vaginal microbiome. And essentially, what's happening there is lactobacillus creates a pH balance that is well maintained for the health of the vaginal microbiome, but it prevents pathogens. So pathogens tend to not like a really acidic um, pH. And so that prevents pathogens within that specific area of the body. Then also, your microbiome can just literally take up real estate and prevent the pathogen from being able to interact with the host cells because they're taking up real estate and kind of neutralizing the area in terms of the access that a pathogen might have to the environment, to the host cells. They can help stimulate the body's various lines of defense. So your body is constantly taking in. Remember when we were talking about those dendritic cells and macrophages and mast cells? Your body is constantly taking in information about various foreign substances and various pathogens, potential pathogens within the environment. That includes taking in information about the microbiome. And the microbiome essentially gives your body a sample of what are healthy microorganisms, what are healthy and natural microorganisms within the environment. And when your body recognizes those, then it's more likely to specifically be able to identify pathogens that are unhealthy, that are pathogenic, right? Versus organisms, and there has been research on organisms that are not exposed to the microbiome, essentially like organisms that are raised in a sterile environment, which is not a natural environment. It's a lab, an artificial environment. But what we see off of these organisms, like sterile mice, for example, is that their immune system is not sure, right? They're not really able to differentiate between natural microorganisms and pathogenic microorganisms because they haven't spent as much time understanding, communicating with, interacting with a natural set of microorganisms. And so it's more likely to overreact where it says, okay, well, this is a bacteria, so it's definitely different from our cell, and this must be a pathogen, even if it's not, right? And so the microbiome allows for your immune system to be more familiar with what is a natural set of microorganisms and be more quick to identify pathogens. Also, when we are talking about mucus, we said that the body produces antimicrobial peptides and lysozymes and things like that, but also the microorganisms themselves in your microbiome produce various types of antibiotics because they're just trying to maintain their own real estate, right? And so they will try to outcompete other organisms within the environment. And if those organisms in your microbiome are predominantly healthy, then as they produce those antibiotics, then they will actually outcompete other pathogens in that area. Um, some of our microorganisms in our microbiome are releasing various types of vitamins and nutrients that we actually can't produce. So folic acid is a really good example that the microorganisms in our microbiome are able to release that, and we need it, but we can't produce it on our own. And we're going to come back to folic acid because it becomes important in our discussion in chapter 10. And so um, and also some of those chemicals that microorganisms produce actually help modulate our immune system and even just our mood and our kind of overall health. And so in that way, our microbiome is really, really essential. And like I said, I wish that these slides had been a little bit earlier and we had talked about them with the mucus when we talked about mucus. But remember that microorganisms and the microbiome cover many of the surfaces of our body, not all, because there are sterile surfaces internal to our body. But all of those interfaces, so the skin and all of our mucosal membranes, tend to have some level, depending on the surface, of interaction with a natural, healthy microbiome. And those surfaces of microbiomes essentially help our skin and our mucosal membranes provide that initial line of defense against potentially pathogenic microorganisms. And so that's one of the reasons why in this class we continue to come back to this idea of considering microorganisms within a holistic kind of system, right? Microorganisms are important to nature. So in our lab, we actually interact with the bacteria and the nodules and the fava beans in the garden, right? Because that's where they naturally engage with systems rather than the artificial setting of the lab. And if we can think about our own human body and the microbiome as these natural cycles that work together in community, literally, because it's a community of different species of microorganisms, then we're more likely to be able to actually address pathogen and illness more efficiently because our body is already doing these things. Whereas if we isolate out and we say, okay, here's, an illness, let's just throw antibiotics at it, but then we actually diminish the capacity of our own microbiome because of those antibiotics, or we throw antibiotics at something like a viral infection, which is not going to be impacted by antibiotics, right? We said that viruses are different from prokaryotes and they're not going to be impacted by antibiotics because they're not alive. You need very specific antivirals, and we'll talk more about that in chapter 10. And so if we diminish the capacity of our microbiome, which diminishes the capacity of our immune system, then overall we have worked against that holistic ability and capacity of our body to provide lines of defense. Okay. And so really understanding that and considering that is also important. And we had a number of discussions about that when we talked about our homework assignments. Okay. Um, so essentially what we've talked about in this section is our skin, sweat, snot, blood, our skin, sweat, snot, and tears. What remains is our blood. And so in the next part of our discussion of this chapter, we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about what are the components of blood and how do they protect us and provide a barrier for us against potential pathogens. But we'll go ahead and pause there. Go ahead and aggregate the information that you've learned in this section about your various kind of initial layers of defense and aggregate your information about your skin, sweat, snot, and tears so that you'll have that part for your discussion and then you can finish it off after we talk about blood. Okay, so I'll see you in the second part in just a bit.